Okay, in this class, I'm going to describe how aspect-oriented programming is used to specify transaction management in Spring. So, in aspect-oriented programming, we have a concept of a point cut and the concept of an advice. Point cut basically identifies a certain area of your program, and in Spring, you specify a point cut using some kind of a regular expression. And every point cut is given an ID. So once you specify an expression, that whole big expression can be referred by using this ID. So in this particular example, we are defining an expression which says that use all the methods from the class XML transaction test service, which is part of the comp training Spring transactions declarative XML package. And in this class, it is saying that pick up all the methods. Dot star is a wildcard. It says pick up all the methods from this class and they can take any number of arguments. So this point cut identifies all the methods of this particular class, and this complex expression can then referred in other parts of the Spring configuration by this ID. An advice specifies the transaction behavior that you attach to some methods. These methods again can be full explicit names, or they can again be regular expressions. Regular expressions can use wildcards. So in this particular case, for any methods which begin with the name find, and they could be ending with anything because the star is a wildcard, we are saying that it's a read-only method. That means there is no transaction required for it. Whereas there are some other methods that we are using. For example, these three add methods, we are saying that it requires the transaction propagation of requires new. Requires new means it will always start a new transaction, even if there is an existing transaction. Whereas there are other attributes like mandatory. Mandatory means if there is no existing transaction, this method will throw an exception. And required means it will not start a new transaction, but if it will use the existing transaction in which this method is invoked. And supports means that, and if in the required, if there is if the method is not running within a transaction, it will start a transaction. And supports means it can run within a transaction or without a transaction. So the difference between requires new and required is requires new will always start a new transaction, and required will only start a transaction if the existing transaction doesn't exist. And then we also specify some things like no rollback for. That means if this particular exception is thrown, this expected exception is thrown, then the transaction will commit. It will not roll back. Whereas in this particular case, if any exception is thrown in both in this one and this one, it will always roll back the transaction because we have not specified no rollback for attribute for these two methods. And then this transaction advice can also be given an ID, and then you can refer to that ID in other areas of your program. So here in the AOP config, AOP is the aspect-oriented programming configuration. You attach the transaction advice to a point cut. So you are specifying that you want to have this transaction behavior on this point cut. The point cut is your area of the program. So in this point cut basically refers to all the methods in the XML transaction test service. So for all those methods, you want to attach this transaction behavior. So if those for all the methods in this class which start with the word find, it does not need any transaction. It's a read-only operation. Whereas for all the methods which start with an add customer, it will always start a new transaction. So this advisor basically maps a point cut to an advice. So it attaches an advice to a point cut. That means an advice is nothing but behavior that you're attaching to a certain point cut, to a certain area of your program. And ref means a reference. So you have already defined this tx advice here, and you're referring to it by advice-ref. Similarly, you have defined a point cut with an ID of XML transaction test service operation, and you refer to that point cut ID by this point cut-ref. So the most important thing is this propagation attributes. You need to know all these 5 of them, 4 or 5 of them. Requires new always starts a new transaction, regardless of whether there is an existing transaction or not. Required will start a transaction only if there is no existing transaction. Mandatory means that it will always needs a transaction context. If there is no transaction context, it will throw an exception. And supports means that it can run with or without a transaction. You can see all this in the Spring documentation as well. I'll send you the links for all the Spring documentation for the transaction attributes. So we'll end this class here.